We have Mark Goodman, principal of Goodman Commercial, which is a Vancouver-based commercial real estate firm located, obviously, in the west side of Vancouver. And he's, for those, a lot of you who are watching this, you follow the Goodman Report. He is the co-publisher of that with Cynthia Jagger. So, Mark, thank you for coming.
Thank you very much, Paige. Nice to be here.
So, Mark, everyone's interested in this, what's happening on trend with real estate and residential, and Ruthie and I often field questions on the fly and on a daily basis. What we wanted to find out from you is what's happening in the commercial space since COVID-19.
Yeah, so Cynthia and I head Goodman Commercial, and our focus primarily is rental apartment buildings and development sites, so land. We do some commercial property as well, but the majority is multifamily investments. Just before COVID hit, we were coming out of a period, a slower period, which I think the residential market also experienced, and things were really heating up in our market. And so we were dealing with multiple offers and a lot of listings coming in. It really felt like we were getting back to normal. We actually flew to Toronto a couple months ago on behalf of some clients to introduce some of our larger offerings to major institutional buyers. So we take this pilgrimage to Toronto every year or so, and we meet with 5 or 6 of the bigger real estate investment trusts and pension funds. And at that time in Toronto, COVID was just starting. They were actually 2 weeks ahead of us. So they had the social distancing protocols were sort of in place. It was a weird time when we met with these larger investment groups. In some cases, we were shaking their hands. In other cases, we were warned to keep 6 feet away, and we had to sanitize our hands, and there were no masks at that time. So, but when the appetite for investments was very strong. In fact, it felt like there was a flight to safety now from a lot of investors who had cashed out of the stock market or were concerned about their portfolio crashing in the stock market. So there was this influx of interest during this time. It was quite unprecedented. I had 7 or 8 offers going on when we returned from our trip. I was working 12-hour days for a period of 4 or 5 days because of the intense interest. And I think another reason we had this, what was fueling the market, were very low interest rates. They dropped again. And so a lot of buyers who were waiting on the sidelines, who couldn't quite make the numbers work, when interest rates dropped, it started to make everything look more attractive. So there was an intense period of interest at the beginning of COVID, particularly for multifamily, because it's seen as a safe haven, a flight to safety. But then when Vancouver or BC started implementing stricter physical distancing rules, it did slow things down for the first couple of weeks, because we were all, as you guys know, reorganizing the way we do business. I never used Zoom or Skype before COVID. And so we set up all our systems, we work remotely, we use Dropbox, Authentisign, which I know is quite prevalent in the residential industry. We weren't doing very much of it, and now I've become an expert in Authentisign. It's the greatest program. So there was a period of a couple weeks where we had to recalibrate our systems. And since then, we've been extraordinarily busy again. So it seems to me that there's no one trend line I can point to. It really depends on the timing and the asset class. I can't speak to other asset classes in the commercial real estate industry, but certainly land and multifamily has been of interest the last few weeks.
Are you seeing first-time buyers jump into multifamily, or mostly big business?
I would say that the investors that are expressing interest right now are not first-time buyers. The majority of the investors that we're speaking with, and sellers for that matter, are local family-based businesses, who are familiar with residential multifamily real estate. They see this as a really bad snowstorm that's going to blow over. I think the smart money is out right now, Ruthie, because the supply demand imbalance in the rental industry is so pronounced that the fundamentals are there for the multifamily industry to be a very safe place to invest. And what I mean by that is there's just not enough supply to house all the people moving to BC and Vancouver. The development sites that we have, those have been extraordinarily active. Last week, we put a large multifamily rental site under contract on 33rd and Main. And we had multiple offers from the big name developers coming in. So it seems to me that the development community, again, sees this as a short-term economic challenge, but they look to the future. Any site that they buy now will probably be redeveloped in a couple of years. So there's a long time lag right now, and it's affording them the opportunity to go look at opportunities that otherwise would be more challenging just because the depth of the market's not where it used to be. However, there's certainly a group of buyers and investors that are taking advantage of, I guess, less competition right now, but we're not seeing prices drop. And it's still too early to tell because it takes time to gather all the data, but we're not seeing any significant drop in prices right now.
So one of the
again, we've only been in this environment for a couple months now, so it's hard to give you any clear data. So I would just sort of give you like my sense just from the street right now. There have been several individuals and major groups who have called me over the last 4 weeks. And in some cases, they've said, look, we've cashed out of the stock market and we want to move forward with residential. I always qualify that and say, well, what are your yield expectations? What are your cap rate expectations? Because we haven't seen any significant upward movement in cap rates. And for those who are not aware, the cap rate is the return on investment that you would get. So typically in the multifamily space, for the older wood frame apartment buildings, the cap rate generally is hovering around 3%, so 3% yield. Some of these investor groups that are calling are used to higher yields in their other investment vehicles that they're cashing out of. So even though they're interested in moving into the commercial space, for some of the investors I've spoken to, the low cap rates don't work for them. There are other investment groups that haven't cashed out of the multifamily space. They're doubling down. And so they're wanting to either refinance and take advantage of these low rates and reinvest in multifamily, knowing that that the buildings in some cases aren't collecting 100% of the rents. There are some buildings are faring better than others, and we could talk about that a little later. But I would say that yes, it's a good time to buy commercial real estate. I think it's always a good time to consider buying commercial real estate and multifamily real estate because of, again, the inherent supply-demand imbalance that we have. And the smart money is out right now. They're looking for the long term. And many perceive this situation, again, as a short term. What will the new normal look like? I don't think anybody knows. But the reality is that everybody needs a place to live. And I also sense that there's more positivity right now with Dr. Bonnie's latest announcement yesterday as well, to reconfirm that we are, is it the beginning of the end or the end of the beginning? I'm not sure what the saying was, but things are looking up right now. Mm-hmm. We did a survey April 1st, a formal survey, which we published in a webinar through the Urban Development Institute.
I attended that. It was very good.
No, thank you. Well, it wasn't me speaking. It was my colleague, Cynthia. But what we did is we interviewed probably a dozen or so landlords, ranging from major institutional groups in BC and Toronto that own and manage thousands of units, to medium-sized based operators that manage 2 or 3 buildings, from 20 suites to 75 suites. And then, the mom and pops that own, a 6-suiter or an 8-suiter. And what we gleaned from this was that it was quite choppy when the data came in. So some of the professionally managed larger institutional groups, we were seeing in some cases 3 to 5% where there was non-payment or partial payment of rent. There were some other apartment buildings that we saw where they were hitting the 20% range. And then in some extreme cases, we saw 45%. And in those buildings, unfortunately, some of the tenants, there's this movement, this rallying cry to really give it to the landlord and stop rent payment, which hurts everybody. It's a domino effect because these landlords, their profit margin is very small. So they're having to pay mortgage, insurance, taxes, utilities, repairs and maintenance. And even a slight dip in income can affect the bottom line. So for example, if a building had 20% of the tenants not paying rent, the actual net operating income that the landlord would receive would drop by 50%. Because remember, these properties are highly leveraged in some cases.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So a 20% drop in rental rates for 1 month actually hurts the landlord's income by 50%. And so for a lot of the smaller owner operators of apartment buildings, they've been devastated. And it's their nest egg. Another property that we're going to be listing, or actually that we're receiving offers on, there are 2 buildings side by side with 175 units. It's in a suburb outside of Vancouver, and the rental, it's 3%. 3% aren't paying or providing partial payment. So it seems to me now that that the government programs are assisting the landlords and the tenants right now. I don't think it's enough, particularly in Vancouver. And I know Landlord BC, which is an organization that supports rental housing providers, is calling for an increase in that subsidy because rents obviously are a lot higher in Vancouver than they are in other areas of BC.
What is your silver lining in this whole COVID experience, both professionally and personally?
That's a really good question. On a personal level, before COVID hit, and I'm sure you and Ruthie can attest, like we were redlining it. It was hard. Like you're going 24/7, and there's always this challenge to balance your professional and personal life with the kids and assisting in homework and getting them outside and exercising and doing all these things. And what this environment has done is it's really changed a lot of our focus. And certainly there's been more time to spend with the family, less time to spend with friends, unfortunately. But I think what we have learned is that there's other ways to do business, and it's forced us to use Zoom and other communication devices to keep things going. So a slower pace and perhaps at times less stressful from a business standpoint, but at the same time more stressful because, you guys are a great example of communicating through your podcasts to your stakeholders and to your friends and colleagues and clients. And I think one thing that I've learned is that just because there's this challenge of not being as efficient doesn't mean that you need to stop. I think if anything, we need to keep doing what we're doing, communicating with our clients and friends, because this will be over one day and we'll be ready to get back to life and just appreciate how good everything was before this happened.